Do you go big or small? One of the things I really love is when you find out something that makes sense, but then you find out it's not true. For instance, most people would think that if you have roads that when you're driving that are nice and wide, they're going to be safer. But in fact, that's not really true at all. Narrow roads are safer than big, wide roads, which is strange until you think about it a second. If you have a big wide road, you're not really paying attention to the specifics because you got room to roam. You don't have to focus on anything. Narrow roads demand a bit more of your attention. Narrow is better when it comes to driving. Who would have thunk? But it's also that way for writing. When beginning writers approach their topics, one of the things they tend to do is look for big, broad topics. And the thinking behind this, I guess, is that if there are a lot of possible options, then there's going to be less chance of sitting around trying to figure out what to do because there'll be tons of options to choose from. But things don't really work out that way. And let me give you a little example to show this. Imagine I told you your first paper was a 3 to 5 page paper on sports. I know what you're thinking. I even know what you're probably looking like. Because 3 to 5 pages to do sports? There are tons of different sports. Which sport are we talking about? You're going to have to spend some time trying to think of that. Are you thinking of some issue common to all of these sports, to some of these sports? And even if I told you to focus on a specific sport, doing a 3 to 5 page paper on baseball is going to lead to a whole lot of the same thinking. Because there's just option paralysis. There's way too much stuff going on. Here's the rule. Specific is better. Specific is always going to be better. When you're writing, getting specific will really help you. What should you be specific about? You should be specific about your subject of analysis, the subject of your paper. You should be specific about the claim, the argument you're making. Being specific about your critical approach is also a really good idea. Why is specific better? Well, there's tons and tons of reasons. But one I want to bring to your attention is the burden of proof. If you claim it in a paper, you have to prove it. That's what your thesis is. Your thesis is outlining this is what I need to do to succeed in your paper. And the broader that is, the more stuff you're going to have to do in order to prove your point. If you have a specific defined thesis statement, a specific defined argument, a specific defined subject, then it's going to be much more reasonable to be able to accomplish everything you need to be able to do. Now, the question you need to ask yourself then is your topic too broad? And there's some sub-questions. Does a stupid amount of research exist on it? If you were to go to the library, would there be shelves and shelves? Or, probably more accurately, if you were to do a Google search, would there be tons of results? Say you were interested in crime. Well, a brief Google search for crime leads you with 2,870,000 plus results. Where do you get started with that? Another sub-question to help you determine whether you are trying to do too much and whether you need to get more specific. Could someone write an entire book on just my topic? Or just your claim? In the case of crime, well, yeah. And this would probably be a stupidly broad book. There's many more specific books to be written on crime. So if you're writing a 3 to 5 page paper on it, you got to really narrow your search. So, another sub-question to determine whether your paper topic is too broad. Do I have utterly no idea how to get started? Broad subjects tend to lead to option paralysis, and people struggle to come up with an approach. It happens. So, if you've answered any of these questions and thought, gee, maybe I'm trying to do something too broad, and as an aside, as a teacher, most Comp 1 and Comp 2 students are trying to do too broad of stuff. The question then becomes, what do you do about it? How do you respond to the sudden realization that you're trying to do way too much stuff? There's a few different approaches. One plan of attack is to get really aggressive in defining all your terms and concepts in as specific as a way as possible. Say you were still interested in that whole crime thing. Crime is too big on itself, so how do we narrow down crime to something that's more reasonable? Define the where. Where are we talking about? Crime in all America? Crime in all of Toledo? Crime in a specific Toledo neighborhood? Or crime in a specific part of a specific neighborhood in Toledo? The more specific you get, the more easily definable your subject is. So specific here. Define what exactly you're talking about, because all crime is not the same. You have vehicular crime. Not really what we think of when we think of crime, but it's violating law and there's enforcement, so. There's drug crime. There's violent crime. There's non-violent crime, like straight robbery. Now, of course, straight robbery may end up being violent. You might end up having violent drug crime or non-violent drug crime, but the more you define, the more you're going to be able to focus. Another thing to define, who are we talking about? Crime affects a lot of people. Are we dealing predominantly with it from a police officer's perspective? Are we dealing with it predominantly from a criminal's perspective? Are we dealing with it for its effect on a community? Another thing to define, what specific issues within the larger subject are we interested in? Are we interested in gangs and crime? It's not just big cities like Cleveland or Detroit or New York. There's Toledo gangs too. Are we trying to tie our crime into the state of the neighborhood? There's a criminal justice theory called the broken windows theory that states that if there's a neighborhood where there's small problems and nobody addresses the small problems, problems will get bigger and crime and disorder will follow. New York in the 80s and 90s quite famously employed the broken windows theory to crack down on every single bit of crime and every small problem in an effort to try to really get a grasp on crime in New York. Look at crime in the 70s in New York. It was bad. And it did kind of work, but the inventor of the broken windows theory did state that there's a consequence to employing it as a policing strategy, and that's that you tend to focus on minority groups. And policing did tend to focus on the poor, the black, so on and so forth. It isn't the only way to think about dealing with crime. There's also hotspots policing, where you put the officers where there are the most crimes, which seems kind of logical. But it's not just police who get to deal with crime, because crime involves neighborhoods and then involves people in the community, and that involves things like crime watches. And there's a certain amount of overlap between crime watch and the policing. And a lot of the same issues will pop up. But when the policing is instituted by the people who live in the neighborhood, it's a slightly different thing. Another way we can define our terms a lot better, when. Crime nowadays is not the same as crime in the 80s, which is not the same as crime in the 50s. So defining terms can get us a lot of the way there. Another possible plan of attack is to take the subject as you understand it, and the more narrow you have it, the better off you're going to be, and compare it to something that's kind of similar. And comparison contrast tends to bring up the things that are specifically interesting about your subject. If we were to take Toledo crime, which we've talked about before, and compare it to Detroit crime, yes, they have crime in Detroit too. Who would have thunk? We're going to see what's specifically interesting about the crime that we're talking about in the specific neighborhood in Toledo. If we were to take the specific Toledo crime and compare it to crime in a small town, like, say, Paulding, Ohio. I couldn't find a fancy chart about Paulding, Ohio, but there's crime there. It's going to, again, show us what's specifically interesting and unique to our subject. And the more specific you get, the more focused you get, the easier planning out your paper is going to become, and the easier satisfying that burden of proof is going to become. And it's going to make your life a whole lot better. You're going to hear me say it about 80 million times this semester if you haven't already. Narrow is better, specific is better, focused is better. When you narrow down on your subject, when you get something specific you want to say, you're going to have a much easier time saying it. Get narrow, get focused. I know you might be interested in big picture things, but use a small scale example and a small scale argument to start to illustrate those wider issues. You can always, as your paper goes along, expand to larger areas of significance, and you should be doing that. But you can only do that if you start narrow and specific. So focus. If you want, I'm happy to talk to you about your topics for any papers and ways to make them more narrow and specific. And also keep in mind that a lot of this happens at the very specific parts of your argument, the thesis statement, the topic sentences. Narrow and specific will help you out. Focus will set you free. Honestly. See you next video.